All right, today I'm super excited to have Casey Ellis. He is the founder, chair, and CTO at Bugcrowd, a crowdsourced cybersecurity platform. They also just released a new report, which is fantastic, called Inside the Mind of a Hacker 2023, which I will link to in the episode notes. And with that, welcome to the Data Exchange podcast, Casey.
Thank you for having me, Ben.
So, one of the reasons I'm excited about having Casey here today is I've long had a fascination with cybersecurity. I know enough, I guess, probably to understand the basics and kind of the layout of the industry, but not enough to really understand what the trends are. So in this episode, Casey will help us understand how people are viewing some of these new trends around AI and generative AI, cybersecurity professionals and CISOs in particular. So topic number one is attacking foundation models, attacking LLMs. So mega trend here, of course, is software is eating the world, and AI and generative AI are eating software. That's trend number one. Trend number two, I think, even though ChatGPT was only released in November, I think by this point, everyone has come to agree that enterprises and companies want custom foundation models, custom models. Yep. So not only will we have to grapple with these public APIs, but companies want domain-specific
their own stuff,
LLMs customized for their application or for their domain. So we're going to have an explosion of these, kind of like a mixture of experts, of models, right? So maybe within a company, there's an LLM that does one thing, another LLM that does another thing. So long-winded way of saying that this is a new attack surface. It's another piece of software. So Casey, I noticed in your report, one of the things you folks highlighted is that you found across the board that CISOs are already considering the potential cybersecurity risks of generative AI. So can you elaborate a little bit about what you've been hearing from the field?
Yeah, 100%. Look, I think the thing that you mentioned ChatGPT launching last year. I think the thing that did. There's some technology innovation involved, like large language models and AI, predates November of last year by a long ways, right? But what happens with ChatGPT is that we basically dumped the idea on the entire internet like all at once, and actually made it accessible. I think prior to that, the idea of what AI actually is and what it can do was pretty abstract to a lot of people, including CISOs, including people in the boardroom, including people outside of data science and folks that actually had their hands in the dirt on this stuff. So, of course, what that triggers is a lot of conversation, a lot of excitement, a lot of concern. The thing that we saw happen pretty much straight away was the hacking community and kind of the white hat hackers that we work with on the Bugcrowd platform, saying, okay, well, how do I monkey with this thing and get it to do stuff it's not meant to do? So they started to hack it and play with it through that lens. But also, like, how can I use these tools to make me more effective as I'm going off and doing security research or vulnerability discovery on other systems, right? So how can LLMs and generative AI provide a lever for me as a hacker? And that was literally day one, like that. I mean, it's literally what I did the first time I logged into chat.
So let's focus on the attacking the LLMs. So.
Yeah,
how so is this more of like a side hustle right now, or is this already becoming part of what you folks do? This is part of the workflow for most companies.
Yeah, look, from a Bugcrowd lens, like we've been working on attacking machine learning and AI models since probably about 2018. We got brought in with some of the things around mis and disinformation and machine learning's kind of role in accelerating that and actually allowing that to be weaponized. So we came in around that to do model testing and bias testing and different things like that. I think that's really just kind of ramping up a lot now. Like at DEF CON just passed down in Las Vegas, there was a generative AI red team village where like literally thousands of people cycled through do, to literally attack the LLMs and the models that some of the vendors brought to the floor, and they were actually testing for bias. That was mostly the idea of like, are there biases inherent in the training data that aren't necessarily disclosed in the system card that you can identify and actually abuse as a potential attacker. So there's stuff like that going on. And honestly, I think that whole idea of what even is a vulnerability in this world of AI, where everything's kind of inherently a bit grayer than it is in traditional computer science, like a lot of that's actually in the process of being defined right now.
Yeah, so staying with LLM, so you have a system that's text in, text out. So I imagine for our audience that's not familiar with the crowd that Casey hangs out with, the hacker crowd, they're relentless. They're very inventive.
Yep.
They probably will come up with prompts that normal people would not come up with. So to the people, Casey, that are building these custom models inside an enterprise, what would you say is the minimum they should be doing around testing for security?
Yeah, I think even just thinking through what the potential risks are at the design stage is actually probably the most important thing, because the challenge with LLMs once they're trained, and you're starting to build on top of them, it becomes progressively more difficult to go back and retrain, depending on the assumptions you kind of built out downstream, right? So this idea of malicious training, poisoning, those kind of things. Then if you've got a supervisory loop in there, malicious supervision is a design consideration that needs to be factored in. Just thinking about, like, if someone was to walk up to this thing with malintent, like, what would they do? Like, if I was a bad guy, what would I do to attack the thing that I'm about to build? And certain people are really good at thinking that through. I think that's a lot of that's kind of my background. It's the background of a lot of folk that we work with in a Bugcrowd context. And I don't think you need to be like a self-declared hacker or security person to at least begin to think in that way. But at least recognizing the importance of soliciting that type of feedback, just to question your assumptions at the design phase. I think that's probably the most important part, because one of the challenging things about AI, we've seen this in the past as well with stuff like IoT, with connected cars. Like, anytime there's a new technology that kind of drops on the internet and moves really quickly, people want to build stuff as fast as they can, and that tends to happen at the expense of safety and security. So this idea of just stopping for a moment to think through, the things that might be able to be abused or to cause harm, and trying to design around as many of those as you can at the outset, I think is pretty important.
So the way I parse what you just said is the following. Correct me if I'm wrong, right? So it's one thing to train a model and then to hammer it after the fact, right? So kind of I guess the equivalent of penetration testing, prompt injection kind of thing, right? As opposed to thinking through the entire model, the setting, the applications, the users from the get-go. Casey, does that mean there's a role for the cybersecurity team to even examine the training data or the fine-tuning data, right? So let's say it's already been pre-trained, and then all you're doing is fine-tuning it or doing some kind of domain-specific model refinement.
Yeah.
But you folks might be able to bring something to the table to just figure out, hey, you're going about your customization wrong.
Absolutely. So to me, like adversarial, like hacker input is basically just taking the assumptions that the designer has and tipping them upside down to see what falls out, right? And the thing is, that's actually difficult for the designer to do themselves most times, because they're just trying to make the damn thing work, right? So this is where kind of it takes a crowd kind of kicks in, and that external feedback becomes very valuable and quite important. And to your point, it can happen, I think, at any point in the design phase. Once you've got the thing trained and it's out there in production, all right, like, what did we miss? Is there anything in there that we tried to prevent, or that we just straight up didn't think of that's able to be abused? And if there is, how do we mitigate that? Right back to the design phase, and actually being able to look through the training data and even how the model's being designed from an assumption standpoint. I think that kind of input can be inserted pretty much anywhere in the process, and the more of that thinking gets applied, ultimately, the more resilient the system will be as an output of that. So that's where I kind of advocate for that happening the whole way through.
So this might be kind of a hard question to answer, but you take the space of generative AI, LLMs, and maybe kind of the stable diffusion type models, right? So these foundation models.
Yeah.
Where are we in terms of how people think about security and basically kind of hammering these applications compared to like your typical web app or mobile app?
Yeah.
So what's the level of maturity of practice and workflow?
Yeah, I mean, look, the number of people that can do that think about web application security as an example, probably the big difference is that web applications are incredibly accessible, so it's easy to start to learn, and they've been around for a really long time and very visible at this point in time. So what that leads to is this very large population of people that can actually do that type of thing, just because of the nature of web apps themselves, right? With AI, I think accessibility to a broader population is comparatively more recent. And yeah, it's a fairly small community of people. It's growing really quickly. And I would say that, for the data scientists and the folks that are into this stuff in your audience, there's a lot of career opportunity in this area going forward, because we're slapping, AI and machine learning and LLMs on absolutely everything that we can think of at this point in time. And generally what happens down the track is we'll realize a bunch of security assumptions that we actually got incorrect. And at that point in time, there's a like, oh crap moment. And folks that have this combination of data science expertise and cybersecurity expertise, especially on the offensive side, become very much an in-demand thing pretty quickly. So yeah, there's not enough to go around is the short answer to your question, and there needs to be more, but that is ramping up pretty quickly. And I will say as well, with the AI Village that I just mentioned down at DEF CON, the Red Team event, there was a line to get into that village like the entire time. The 3 days, like you couldn't just walk in. There was like a pretty decent sized queue. So there's a ton of interest in this, which is really cool, but we need more people because this is just everywhere. And it's really kind of going to be the future of how the internet works.
So to some extent, I think so. I mean, maybe I'm being kind of somewhat optimistic here, but to some extent, I think for LLMs and these models, there's at least a somewhat of recognition that, okay, we have to at least test a little bit for bias, fairness and bias, right? Security, I think intellectually people say that, but I don't know if they even know the first steps. Right. So in the bias and in fairness, I think at least there's some literature and some segment of the data science and AI community who've been working on it and are concerned about it. On the security side, I think I've talked to people a lot in the past, and to some extent, a lot of I don't know, Casey, you correct me. To some extent, I think a lot of what they say sounded a bit like science fiction, right? So like model inversion and, stealing data, things like, okay, intellectually, these are cool, but do they really happen? Right. So whereas the fairness and bias seem like they really happen.
Yes. Yeah.
So I guess two questions here. One is what can people do as a basic step around security for these LLMs and foundation models? And two, do they really have to worry about anything at this point?
Yeah, so we're talking about two things there in terms of like the security of the user of the LLM and the security of the LLM itself. So because I think model bias, hallucinations, undeclared bias, those sorts of things, that more often than not will have a downstream impact on the user that could end up in aggregate harming the LLM or the owner of the LLM. But then there's the LLM security in and of itself. So things like model inversion, like deriving a model, that is doable. Like that has
but is there like a headline story? Someone reverse engineered the Netflix recommender.
Look, I mean,
there's it's not like It's not like a data loss.
You could
Every week we have a headline, right?
You could argue that SEO as an industry exists because people have been doing this the entire time in terms of, the application of ML to search results. So like there's versions of this that exist around the place. Are they malicious? Like, do they cross the boundary where,
Or do they rise to the kind of, this is one of the top things I have to worry about?
I think that's going to be an open question that's going to be context specific going forward. But I guess the thing that's important there is that it's not science fiction in terms of it being a thing that should be considered. It's not necessarily the most important thing. It's not necessarily something that should keep you up at night. But if you're designing a system that's going to have like a lot of like core intellectual property or a lot of incredibly private data as a part of the model itself, then maintaining the secrecy of that data and trying to figure out how you actually implement that within your model should be a design consideration. Versus like if you don't care because you're working with public access data or whatever else, then it doesn't really matter as much.
So what are some of the basic things people can do right now if they're customizing a model? Yeah,
I think one of the things, and actually you mentioned IP leakage as well. So the idea of there being supervisory input into an LLM based on its use, making sure that you're considering the fact that users do tend to get pretty excited and might create prompts that contain intellectual property that shouldn't be let out of the gate inside their organization. Like, is that a design factor for the solution that you're putting together? Like, does that matter if you've got a proprietary LLM like foundation model that's within an enterprise or within an organization that's only going to be consumed by that enterprise, then you're not as concerned about that because the data will theoretically only flow inside that organization. But if there's a public interface to that, then you've got to think about, almost like the high side, low side considerations of the data that it's trained with. But I think in particular, this idea of there being stuff that comes in as a supervisor or like an after the fact insertion into the model based on its use. Like that's where there's been a lot of information leakage. That's actually happened quite a bit. So examples of proprietary source code turning up in code snippets that came from a particular organization because based on how the whole thing kind of came about, it looks like someone within that organization put that code in there to ask a debugging question or something along those lines. So the model gets trained on that through the supervisory piece, and then all of a sudden it spits out somewhere else. Those kind of flows of information, like they happen, they're real. And going back to your question, like what should be considered, it's just literally trying to figure out as best you can as a designer, like what are the flows of this going to look like? What are the things that I need to consider? What information, what inputs need to not go where? Like how do I start to design this from an information architecture and an information flow standpoint, not just the utility of the LLM itself, if that makes sense. I think that's pretty important just to be able to actually model that out at the outset and get as much of that right as you possibly can, because that's going to define what you train it with. It's going to define the kind of things that you might kind of data firewall off from actually getting into the LLM in the first place, on the query side, like all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it sounds like this could be an emerging product category in security, right? So the next time I go to an RSA Expo hall, there will be a lot of people selling this stuff.
I think that's right, because there's so much focus on the LLMs themselves right now. There's actually not a lot of most of the stuff that we've seen. Like we work with a bunch of different AI vendors at this point in time, especially since the end of last year, and we kicked off OpenAI's bug bounty program on ChatGPT. I think it was February of this year, and there's just been a lot of activity since then.
Wait. So stop. So it sounds like this is something that if I'm building a custom LLM, I should have some kind of service like Bugcrowd.
I'm glad you said it, not me, because I don't want to sound like a shill. But I mean, look, like what we literally do is to Bugcrowd is essentially, it's two things. It's a platform and it's a community of hackers, but the good kind, right? So a hacker is kind of like someone who can pick a lock. Some of them are burglars, and they're the ones that we need to worry about, but some of them are locksmiths, and they're actually using those skills in good faith to make things more secure. We're like the digital version of that in terms of our community, and then our platform connects. It understands their skills and trustworthiness, where they live, all those different things. We can connect the right people with the right problem to do provide the kind of adversarial feedback that I was talking about before. Yeah, and I think it's, that part's important. And, at a bare minimum for folks that are doing something new, creating what's called a vulnerability disclosure program, and actually having the ability for just whoever it is out there on the internet, if they happen to notice something that's incredibly important or impactful from a security standpoint, that person needs to have a way to tell you. And a vulnerability disclosure program actually enables that. So that's kind of the starting point, but then you can do things that are more targeted, more specific, more ongoing, or even, point in time kind of design assessments, like we talked about before.
By the way, you mentioned, so you made the distinction between, an LLM that's outward facing to customers and an LLM that's internal, but even an internal LLM, right? So think about data governance. There's certain data that I may not be allowed to see even within a company, right? So even there, you probably need to have like a service like Bugcrowd, even if it's an internal LLM, hammer it, right?
100%. And I think as well with that, like data, systems that get built like this have a tendency to creep. So it might start off incredibly contained, but if it works and if it's delivering value, then more of the organization will want to use it. There'll be those discussions all of a sudden, some of your data governance and your kind of compartmentalization assumptions that you had at the design phase get violated because you've built something that's useful, right? This happens all the time. And what, when you breach that compartment, all of a sudden you've got all this kind of retrofitting that you have to do because you haven't really thought about who's looking at, data or accessing systems in that adjacent compartment, because that wasn't what it was designed for in the first place. I think building stuff, in this area, like it's at least a good thought experiment to consider the fact that it'll probably end up being used publicly at some point in the future. Let's just assume that this thing's wildly successful and we end up coming up with business use cases to actually make it accessible to, our partners or our customers or whoever else. At some point in the undefined future, like how would we actually accommodate that? That's actually a zero trust design principle. And I think it does apply here as well.
Yeah, interesting. So, so the nice thing about working with professional security people is they bring a level of inventiveness and creativity that, if you were to test this on your own. And Casey, I guess the other challenge with these systems is, I guess, unlike any other software systems, they're really black boxes. I mean, even the people who built them don't know exactly how they work. So there's all sorts of attacks that security people will come up with that a data scientist or an AI person may not think about, right? So.
Yeah. I think for that, so OWASP, was it Open Web Application Security Project? Like it's a project. It's not just web app security. It's a project that's been around for decades at this point in time. And what it has a tendency to do is kind of lead in the creation of vulnerability taxonomies, and just kind of mental models to think about new technology as it comes out. They've just released a top 10, which is basically their top 10 most kind of critical and most exploited vulnerability classes for LLMs. And there's caveats all through it. It's like, okay, this is a work in progress. Like we're in the process of actually defining what being vulnerable actually means in this space, partly because of what you just said. It's like, the black box nature of it. But also the fact that, the responses that you get, interacting with an LLM is inherently fuzzy, which makes it a little bit different from when you're thinking about, for example, web application security vulnerabilities, because it's either vulnerable or it's not, right? Like in traditional CS, if something violates confidentiality, integrity, or availability in a way that wasn't designed, it's a security vulnerability. And that's a fairly clean definition, foundation that you can use. With AI, it's a lot grayer than that. So, I would recommend, back to your question before around like, how do I even think about this? Actually looking at some of the OWASP stuff that they've done to try to pass this out into a framework that people can kind of build a mental model around. I think that's a pretty useful tool. There's a lot of work going into that because it is black box, and I think there's a lot of discovery and definition. Probably the other part I would say as well is that, the regulatory angle on this. I actually get one of the interesting things about Bugcrowd, because, one of the kind of key jobs that we had, when I started the company and kicked off the category 11 years ago, was to convince the market that hackers aren't always bad. And that took quite a bit of work. Like a decade later, we're way further down that path. But 10 years ago, that was a very difficult conversation to have. And there's a policy component to it and a regulatory component to it. So I've been involved in that stuff pretty much this entire time. And there's a lot of attention on this coming from the White House. There's a lot of attention on this coming from state laws. Like New York passed their bias
HR. Yeah.
Yeah.
I need to hook you up with my friends at Luminos.law. They're the first law firm that specializes in AI and analytics, founded by data scientists and lawyers. They've become like the go-to resource for chief legal counsels, but you will have a lot to talk to them about. They were instrumental in writing the NIST AI risk management framework. Yeah.
There you go. Yeah, no, that would be fantastic, actually. And yeah, the reason I call that out is that, you've got, I think there is definitely, falling afoul of regulation that's being like developed at a rapid rate. It's not necessarily, you can't necessarily call that a security vulnerability, but as a organization, it's a risk. Like it's a technology driven risk that you actually need to manage. There's so much of this stuff in flux right now that keeping an eye on that is pretty important. And I do think there's some signal in how New York have done it in terms of, the system cards and actually declaring bias. Because this idea of like, okay, if you've got
once a year, right?
Yeah, if you got it, but here's the thing: if you got a declared bias, but then someone identifies that there's a bias in your training data that you didn't declare because you weren't aware of it, now what? Like, where does that kind of leave you from a liability standpoint, or even from a legality standpoint at that point in time? So there's a lot of that stuff kind of feeding into what is a vulnerability in AI as a discussion as well. And yeah, just keeping across all of that, I think is useful, but there's a huge universe of it. So this is where, hackers come into it and say, hey, here's a problem that you've got specifically, like, let's just address that instead of trying to eat the entire elephant and figure the entire thing out.
So takeaway for part one, which is attacking LLMs, is treat security as a first-class partner from day one, and don't hesitate to bring in external resources before you deploy.
Yep.
Is that a fair assessment?
I think that's a fair assessment. Yeah.
Yeah, because there's just so much that. So for our listeners who've never worked with security professionals, trust me, they bring a lot to the table in terms of relentlessness and inventiveness that your typical data science team or data engineering team will appreciate.
I'm biased, but I agree.
Yeah, so
I would actually add just one brief third thing to that is treat security as a continuous. It's a process, like it's a North Star. It's not a destination.
Exactly.
It's not a thing you actually like finish off and kind of dust your hands off and call a job done, because like the adversary, people that want to exploit these systems, it's their job to innovate past our defenses, and they're not packing up and going home if we get it right. So there's always going to be new things to consider and to think about, and just factoring it in as a part of core engineering, I think is the right way to think about it.
Yeah. All right. So part two, using LLMs for cyber offense, and again here I refer to the Inside the Mind of a Hacker 2023. They have some good data there in terms of how hackers and security professionals are beginning to use LLMs in their work. So, Casey, can you give us a high-level overview of what you think are some of the key use cases and key trends in this area?
Yeah, I'll tap on a couple, and just to speak to the Inside the Mind of a Hacker report for a second. So the two kind of findings that I've been talking about that popped out. 55% of respondents said that generative AI can already outperform hackers, or will be able to do so within the next 5 years, and that's from an efficiency standpoint, right?
Now, can they do 0 days?
Let me come back to that. Here's the flip side of that, though. Like, they're not worried about being replaced. So I think it was 72% said that generative AI will not be able to replicate the creativity of hackers. And that kind of goes, to me, that goes back to what I was saying before about like the entire reason that we're here as an industry is because of a creative adversary, right? So if AI suddenly, from a defensive standpoint, fixes all of the problems that we have today, like the adversary is just going to innovate past that. And that's a product of human creativity. They're going to be using AI to do that as a tool, but it's ultimately driven by human incentive and human creativity, and that's where humans on the defensive side actually like rise to meet that. It's kind of one of the core principles behind Bugcrowd as a business. So I found that really interesting. Like I said before, like the minute ChatGPT dropped, there was a bunch of hackers picking it up, like attacking it, but also trying to figure out how to use it as a lever in attacking other systems. And yeah, I think there's been some, you asked about, can it generate 0-day? I've not seen that happen yet. I've seen people use AI to actually take a vulnerability and build an exploit for it. So like a vulnerability in a piece of software, that's a kind of a bug with benefits that wasn't meant to be there in the first place. But if you want to exploit it, you've got to actually build another piece of code to do that. I've seen people use generative AI to help them in that process. That's not exactly finding or creating an O-Day, but it's like an assisting tool, if that makes sense. Probably the most interesting thing I've seen, and this was actually pretty early on, was the idea of as a pen tester, right? If I'm inside a network with a Linux system that has all my security tools loaded on it, I go out and do like reconnaissance on that network. I then pass the output of that reconnaissance phase out to an LLM that's got the entire body of knowledge of all of the security research it's been able to kind of hoover up into its model. Plus, I tell it my objective, and then I ask it what to do next.
Wow.
That's a real thing, and that was actually a real thing that started. I think the first time I saw someone using something like that was March of this year. So
we gotta limit that token window so they can't dump so much data.
Yeah, well, I mean, sometimes if it's efficient, right, you can actually do this in a fairly targeted way that actually kind of respects token size. Because the idea of like, okay, here's the phone book, like give it back, then yeah, to your point, you run into a token size issue, but you don't necessarily need that much data to give it enough information to tell you what to do next. And if you're a pen tester on the white hat side, like what you're doing is you're actually trying to get to an objective to prove that impact is possible to your client, which is kind of the same as how a bad guy operates, right? Like if I'm malicious, I'm looking for a particular outcome, so I can do almost exactly the same set of things. So to me, that's pretty crazy in the sense that it makes attack easier for everyone. Folks on the defensive side and folks doing offense for the purpose of defense, like what we do at Bugcrowd, and folks that are actually malicious.
But this doesn't, this makes the so-called script kiddies even more advanced, right? Yeah. So by the way, Casey, we talk a lot about ChatGPT and Bard. Okay, that's fine. But now we have these open source models like Llama 2. Now there's Code Llama. Yep. So you can imagine taking Code Llama and fine-tuning the hell out of it for security and vulnerability attacks. I mean, there's nothing we can do about it. I mean, they can just do that, right? So
yeah, well, this is stuff that Bugcrowd actually works on the offense for the sake of defense side. What can we train LLMs with to make our team's more efficient in terms of listening to the crowd and figuring out signal from noise, like identifying things that are high impact. To your point earlier, like how do we identify techniques that are going through the platform that are novel and are potentially 0-day? There's all sorts of stuff like that we've built and that we're continuing to work on internally, and that's actually a part of our that was part of the origin of our partnership with OpenAI in the first place. But yeah, in terms of the open source versions of that, there's a lot of that. Probably the main way I've seen that actually used in the wild that I can talk about, because keeping in mind 90% of the stuff I get to see on a daily basis I can't actually necessarily talk about because sensitive, or it's security impactful, or it's confidential. So that's why I'm always using general terms on a lot of this stuff. But stuff that's known is the idea of spammers and people doing social engineering, right? Actually training models to be more efficient in terms of, being able to get emails out to people and actually elicit a response, or take, inputs and say, like, let's have a chat with someone, some of the SMS stuff that comes through, SMS spam, the initial set of interactions are actually oftentimes driven by an LLM, and it will hand off to a human operator, once it crosses a certain threshold, different things like that. So that's like malicious black hat use of some of these open source models. There's a whole ton of white hat versions of that as well. So to me, again, it just comes back to the idea of like all of this is accelerating. Like what we've done, the way I like to talk about the relationship between hackers and AI with people is it's kind of like Tony Stark in the Iron Man suit, right? Like the suit without Tony Stark isn't as creative or intelligent as it needs to be to get the thing done. But Tony Stark without the suit is weaker than he could be. Like if you put them together, all of a sudden you've got this incredibly powerful combination. And I feel like that's just kind of happened on both sides of the aisle, the good guys and the bad guys. So now it's going to be a matter of like, how do we keep that kind of cat and mouse game in balance as we go forward?
So Casey, again, I guess to return to this earlier point, so Bard and ChatGPT, great, but now you've got these open source models, Llama 2. So I've been using Llama 2 through this fantastic AnyScale endpoint. And what I find is, one, it's faster. I guess the way AnyScale has deployed it is faster, stable. And it's a smaller models. You'll have to work a little bit more on your prompt to get something equivalent out. But once you do that, then you've got the benefit of something faster. Yeah. So, but that's open source. So someone can take Llama 2 and code Llama and use that specifically to generate attacks, right? There's nothing we can do about that.
No, that's right. You're pretty much right. Like using that for whatever objective, using that for attacks from a software standpoint.
Yeah.
As I mentioned before, using it to find ways to more effectively scam an old person out of $10,000. Like,
and we're just talking about text right now. In a few months, we're going to have speech synthesis open source models, right?
Yeah, so you get into the whole area of deep fakes and speech synthesis. Speech synthesis in particular is interesting because it kind of breaks some of the voice authentication stuff that's out there, like the idea of being able to.
Is that true?
It can, yeah. If it's effective, like if the kind of the resolution and the fidelity of the model is sufficient, and you've got it trained with enough stuff to be able to actually. A good voice authentication.
Now you're getting me freaked out. What about the unlock your phone with your face? Will that get broken at some point?
That's been broken at various points in time. Like again, it's cat and mouse, right? Because like the first versions of like actually the fingerprint stuff that got broken by a particular hack that basically was, it went over the finger, so it passed the heartbeat check and some of the like proof of life things that are in the sensor, but it tricked it enough that you could unlock it with basically a latex kind of overlay. Then that got improved on, and all of a sudden, this is going back to what I was saying before about vulnerability research and it being a bit of a cat and mouse game, right? It's like, cool, this thing works. Okay, now we've broken it. Okay, now we need to make it better. And then it just kind of works its way up to become more resilient, right? Same thing happened with Face ID, and that's kind of, that's moved forward. I think probably the biggest piece that I'm concerned about from a straight up like offensive use case standpoint over the next year is just misinformation and disinformation. Like you look at how machine learning was weaponized through social media to do different things heading into 2020. Right. We've got a whole lot more players on the field now at this point in time with a whole bunch of new tools that are incredibly powerful. And we're about to head into an election year here in the US, but there's also similar things happening in other parts of the world next year as well. So that has me a little concerned in terms of how that sort of thing plays out.
And that assumes we can be kind of even generous and assume that's private actors, state actors. That's a completely different level of sophistication. And by the way, Casey, for our listeners who don't follow the security space closely, I mean, just like any industry, it's driven by economics, and there's business models. There's, I mean, ransomware companies even have tech support, right? So I imagine the use of LLMs for cyber offense will also be driven by economics, and business models will emerge, right? So
it's all economically driven at the end of the day. Like even state actors, a nation state has a budget. They've got the degree to which they want to actually achieve a goal, and then that places kind of a restraint around their budget. So at the end of the day, basically any malicious actor is economically rational, and like, to me, that kind of informs defense and how to think about how tall you need to build your fence on that side as well. But yeah, that's exactly how it works.
So part 3, LLMs for cyber defense. Any kind of top line trends here?
Yeah, so a big piece again. This stuff just dropped straight into the hands of researchers. What I saw was a lot of folks in the threat intelligence community start to use LLMs a lot. Basically, what threat intelligence is identifying. It's more about the malicious actors than it is about the vulnerabilities. It's like, who are the bad guys? What are they doing? How do we figure out who they are?
But they're all on Telegram.
That is one of the ways that people get information. But the idea of like taking these different inputs, so you've got social input, you've got like behavior on a network, you've got malware that you might have found, all these different things, and the idea is to be able to create what's called an indicator of compromise that you can share with other people so they can actually catch that adversary. Using LLMs to actually do that part was something that I saw happen pretty quickly. And just generally kind of rule creation across the board.
So basically they're taking all sorts of data inputs, kind of like data fusion, and then having the LLMs kind of synthesize all of this data and give me kind of a threat assessment.
Yeah, I mean,
so instead of using analysts.
With a ton of appropriate prompt, and no, there's still an analyst driving it. So I'm not talking about, it's not like a funnel out of which pops the IOC. It's using LLMs as a lever to get to that IOC faster. Because what you're trying to do is you're trying to distill out an intelligence product that's actually actionable.
Like using the LLM as a massive pattern recognition system.
Essentially, with all of the context an LLM might have in that process. So that was a really interesting one.
So is this conceptual, or is this happening?
This is happening. This is a real thing that I've seen. Individuals. I haven't actually seen it productized yet, but individuals and organizations are using LLMs as a huge point of leverage.
So you can imagine like the next generation of Palantir or something like that, an analyst tool, but with this capability.
Yeah,
I see.
Yeah, essentially. And its entire purpose is to track malicious activity, figure out what are the things that are most likely that a defender needs to think about, like where is the defender at the greatest risk based on how vulnerable they might be or what sector they might be in. If you're a oil and gas company, for example, you've got an entirely different set of threat actors to consider than if you were a bank. So it's there's sort of different things.
So in the absence of an LLM, you can still do all of this, but you would have to.
It's harder.
It's harder.
Yeah, it takes more human capital. It takes more application of human intelligence. What the LLMs do is basically take especially kind of the low order analysis stuff and just make it way faster and way more effective. So if you end up you're in a position where you've got a human in the loop, feeding this input into an LLM and then basically deriving the output, getting to the intelligence product kind of end state that they want to, it just speeds that entire process up, which given all the bad stuff that happens on the internet and the fact that that bad stuff only tends to increase in volume, like that's a pretty important problem to solve. It's like we need to get more efficient at this because we're going to assume that there's going to be more chaos and more bad actors in the future, as well as more technology to defend in the first place. So this continuous pursuit of scale is actually a really important one.
So how many months away are we from this LLMs for threat assessment as a product, as a service?
TBD. It's not. Yeah, that's a stay tuned question. That one. But there's the application
and the people doing this, do they have their own custom LLMs?
Some do. Initially it was using the stuff that was out there and basically taking working off LLMs that had kind of hoovered up half the internet and kind of using that as a part of how they got to their answers more quickly. But there is definitely customization going on now. Getting into a different use case, just real quick, because this one actually I get quite excited about, the idea of using LLMs to fix code.
Would you trust it?
No. Validate it, right? But like you think about this through the lens of the open source security problem. Like finding bugs in open source software is not difficult. Like it's like shooting fish in a barrel, right? Like discovery and identification of vulnerabilities is not the hard part. The hard part is supporting the maintainer in fixing it, because they're propping up half the internet in their spare time, right? So how do you provide low cost leverage into what they're doing to actually make their code base more secure? AI and LLMs are tools that could be potentially brought to bear on that particular problem. And there are people that are working on kind of the private version of that. Like, can you feed a code base into a system and have it spit out bug fixes essentially that you didn't, to your point before, you do validate them. Like you don't just blindly. Maybe one day in the future you do, right? But like right now, not a great idea.
Completely automated, no?
Well, that creates a liability problem, which is a whole other thing. But so there's that's another example. So I just think like I get excited about that because there's like the possibilities are endless, and it's almost, you can sort of see like the offensive side, there's a ton of different things you can do. The defensive side, there's a ton of different things you can do. And there's this sort of balancing act between how AI is applied to both in a way that kind of ideally maintains this sort of homeostasis that we've got on the internet. And hopefully things don't kind of, fall apart and the wheels fall off at any point in the future. If we get that.
Both of these use cases you assume that you describe are, to me, cool and hopeful. They're not like, I was expecting you to say, defense for deepfakes or this and that, but those are inherently kind of cat and mouse games, and the defenders against deepfakes are always behind, right?
Yeah, I think the same's true with most things in offense and defense, because the same thing's true in what I was just talking about. The difference is that if you fix a computer system against a particular thing, it's like that's a state change, right? Whereas with deepfake training, really what you're relying on is the ability to inoculate a population against misinformation. And that's hard. Do you know what I mean? Like people have different biases, they've got different levels of gullibility or skepticism that they apply to stuff like that. And to try to, it's one thing to say, hey, that's a deepfake. It's another thing entirely to get the user to actually care. And I think that second part is the bigger problem that we've got from a disinformation, information warfare standpoint. So, I'm a little like, I think there's a lot of really cool applications that could be used there. We got involved pretty heavily, as I mentioned before, in the election kind of set of issues from 2018 onwards. And that got me into this whole kind of information warfare space, which is just a very deep rabbit hole. There's no perfect solutions in that space whatsoever, that you can only kind of steer things in the right direction. Whereas with the kind of stuff I just talked about, if you fix it, then it's fixed, and it's a matter of moving on to the next thing.
So you didn't verify the election attacks from Italian satellites, right? So anyway, wrapping up very quickly, social, legal, and ethical trends around security and generative AI. Anything that jumps out to you?
Yeah, I mean, I called it out before. The biggest thing that I saw at DEF CON, DEF CON is like 40,000 hackers in the desert. It happens every July, and it's kind of our summer camp here in North America, where we'll trade techniques and share research and just get together. The thing that I observed like really sharply as a trend is this kind of convergence of like security and to some degree privacy. AI as a catalyst for all of this, and the thing that brings that conversation into tech in a really kind of sharp and real way for everyone, and then policy. So as a part of the policy department at DEF CON, there was the head of DHS was there, Jen Eastley from CISA was there. There was literally a parade of congressional staffers, senators, and Congress people that were literally flying down to the desert to see what this hacking thing is all about, and getting sherped around by people like myself and others from the policy department. And like AI is one of the things that's kind of a nexus of all of that. So what we're heading towards is this kind of collision, I think, between AI, regulatory kind of mandates and policy, and this idea of security and privacy being brought in as a driver for all of that. Because that's an issue of retail politics, right? Like the average person at this point in time cares about technology in that way. They view their safety on the internet and safety as they interact with systems as an extension of their physical space. And I feel like that's kind of where we're up to in 2023. So at that point in time, you get the attention of lawmakers, and you end up with policy getting created kind of fairly rapidly around all that stuff. So yeah, I mean,
and obviously there's the geopolitical rivalries, right? So I mean, in many ways, AI is a two-horse race, US and China, and so there's massive geopolitical rivalries around AI.
Yeah, there's definitely that aspect of it. I mean, my personal point of view is that this is going to turn the subtext to a lot of what's happening with AI is that it's actually almost a great power problem, in a sense, like, getting to AGI and getting to, like full leverage of the effectiveness of AI as a nation state that has a similar impact to the overall power of that nation as the development of nuclear weapons in the 50s and 40s and 50s, right? It's not the same, but it's got a similar kind of radical effect in that sort of way. So I think there's a lot more thinking going in that direction. That's not being discussed as much, but there's definitely an undercurrent of that. And that like the whole 6-month moratorium and how that went down is evidence of that. The idea of like, no, we should stop training LLMs for 6 months while we figure out the ethical considerations. It's like, well, we can't do that because China's not going to do that, and we don't want to put ourselves 6 months behind in this kind of great power discussion. So yeah, I mean, it's definitely a subtext to the entire thing that's pretty interesting to keep an eye on.
And just to wind down here, a lot of what we talked about here, I guess kind of in the background, we're talking about large language models deployed on a cloud service where much of the inference is on GPUs. But you look at one of the trends right now is people are applying a lot of the lessons from computer vision, whatever they may be, quantization, distillation, compression. They are able now to run some of these models on really kind of smaller hardware, smaller devices. So we don't know what's going to happen in 2 years. Maybe you will have LLMs offline on a doorbell, right? So
yeah, there's a lot of work going into portability. And yeah, I think there's,
and the security implications as they get deployed on the edge, I don't know, right? So
well, it's funny because I get torn between thinking about that as an entrepreneur and then thinking about that as a security person. Because from a possibility standpoint, I actually get kind of excited about that. But you're exactly right. Like, if you've got a distributed system, then it's inherently easier to attack and to reverse engineer and to do all that kind of different stuff with. So yeah, it's going to be a wild ride. And going back to just a specific shout out to the folks that are going to be in your audience. Like if you're an expert in this field and you've got any interest whatsoever in cybersecurity, like now is the time to start to actually dig into that and bone up, because the need for this kind of input is only going to accelerate as we go forward, and it's going to become a very valuable skill set. So again, with those folks, like literally we've got some training material on that stuff on bugcrowd.com. You can sign up and hack on things on our platform. But even if you don't do that, like just dig into it and start to figure out if this is, the security side of machine learning, of AI, of big data, LLMs, all those different things is something that appeals to you, because we're going to need you in the future.
And I can attest to that. And more importantly for our audience, this is a sector that has budget.
Yeah.
I mean, if you go to their conferences, massive expo halls, but also CISOs are usually well recognized inside enterprises. They have actual budget, unlike, I don't know, chief data scientists, maybe not as well funded as some of these security teams.
Mm-hmm.
And with that, thank you, Casey.
Thank you for your time, Ben. Cheers.